I will say, though, after having this conversation, my confidence does drop on the original claim.
Welcome, everybody, to another Street Epistemology conversation video. I'm Reed. This is Cordial Curiosity. And today I've got Stephen Sorenson. How's it going, Stephen?
Hey, Reed, it's going well. Thanks for asking. How are you?
I'm good. So, yeah, I started this new thing where I'm allowing people to kind of schedule essay conversations with me. If they want to have a private conversation, they can do so with my new Calendly link. Just check my social media. It posts on Twitter like every morning at 8 a.m. I've got it set with an IFTTT. So you'll find it there. I'll probably put a link in the description as well if I upload this. And so, yeah, it's going to be fun. So who are you, Stephen? Want to give an intro?
Yeah, my name's Stephen Sorenson. I study history and chronology. I have a YouTube channel that I'm working on. Mostly I post on my website, but my main thing is that I am looking to study and develop the Wissenschaften, I think is what it's called. It's the word for the sciences and humanities combined.
Sciences and humanities combined. How do you spell that? V what?
WEI. I have it on the front page of my website, I think. Yep. Wissenschaft. Or Wettenschap. Wettenskab. The Italian Scienza.
Okay.
Which it varies a little bit from what it's a little bit of a US European difference there, where the sciences in the US are considered very specific, where some sciences in the European countries, they're more of a discipline, a study. So any systematic approach, it doesn't necessarily have to follow the scientific method for it to be considered a science, which is my understanding of it.
Okay. And the claim you wanted to talk about today was no reliable method exists to date texts prior to the 10th century. Is this related to chronology?
Yeah.
Yeah, what is like chronology in general?
So chronology is the order of past events or the study of that order.
The order of past events or the study of that order?
Right. So, I mean, literally chronology would translate to the study or the science of time. So understanding the nature of time and the things that occur during time, which is the pure chronology would be the study of time, and applied chronology would be applied to historical sciences, or you could apply it to your day. We agreed to meet at 2 p.m. That's a applied chronology right there. The application of the study of time.
Okay, so applied chronology is the study of past events in their order?
Yeah, kind of. It's not like pure chronology is studying time for the sake of studying time, but applied chronology is when you use that pure study to apply it into other fields. So a lot of the time when people talk about chronology, they're talking about it being applied to historical science or history.
And this isn't like, physics type of study of time. It's just what happened in the past?
Or is it can be. Yeah, no, that would definitely, I would say that falls under chronology, study, the physics of time.
So it can go that deep. It can go that deep. Wow. Sweet. Yep. Love it. And so go back to your claim, that chronology relates to dating in the history. So no reliable method exists to date texts prior to the 10th century. Maybe just stepping back, why talk about this claim? Why is this claim important?
Well, there's this idea that human civilization has been around for 4,000 to 6,000 years is, I think, the popular opinion. And a lot of that is based on how people define civilization. And so one of the trademarks of civilization is writing. So once a large population obtains the ability to write and encode information in that way, then they're considered a civilization. And so being able to date when things were written can help determine when civilization had dawned and when those skills started being developed and used.
So historians classify, past human populations as civilized when they start having the ability to write and write stuff down.
It's one of the facets, yeah.
Okay.
Just some others, just to name some, are having agriculture, having a large scale population, having technology. Those are some of the features of civilization.
Agriculture and technology as well. But we're for this claim we're focused on the writing aspect because you need writing to get text in the past.
Right.
And yeah, what else is important about this to make this claim?
Another important thing is that it automatically puts into question any events that come prior to the 10th century, because if we can't reliably date the text prior to that, then we can't say for certain that things were occurring the way that maybe some other people would if they think that we have information from those times.
Puts into question events that happened prior to the 10th century.
So yeah, for me, it's somewhat important for the sciences because it affects our understanding of the Earth-Moon systems and at which rate the moon orbits the Earth, which is, I guess, now that I'm saying it out loud, it's a very technical issue in chronology, is the using eclipses to date events. And so if we have an eclipse in a record, we can figure out when that happened because eclipses happen somewhat relatively similar, like in pacing.
Okay.
So,
Like past people wrote about eclipses because they were kind of strange things that happened, rarely, but so they usually wrote about those things, and you could use those if we had if the moon perfectly rotated at a certain rate or some rate we can calculate, then we can kind of date when stuff was written based on that. Okay, cool.
so yeah, the eclipses are cyclical. They occur in the same place every so often. And so through that, we can determine when these people could have seen the eclipse occurring and then determine when the text was written.
Okay, cool. And yeah, so it puts into question events that happened prior to the 10th century. I'm bad at history. What was happening around the 10th century? Is this the Dark Ages or
It would be the Middle Ages.
Middle Ages?
It was kind of like around the Carolingian Renaissance. So they were kind of starting to get back into academics and scholarship, but it was still prior to the Italian Renaissance a couple hundred years later. So they were like, that's the contemporary idea. I think most historians would agree with that, but I think there's reason to be skeptical about that still. Not to take it as a matter of fact, to then stack more information onto it. I think it needs to be reviewed at least.
Okay. You're skeptical of what was happening around the 10th century and then general, like the ages of like human history, like the Middle Ages, and I'm not sure what was just before that or like later on is like the Enlightenment and then other things.
Yeah, I think the general scheme is the ancient times ended around the 400s, 5th century. Then that went until about the 15th century is when the Middle Ages ended. The Renaissance began. After the Renaissance was the Enlightenment. And then that's kind of modern history is typically placed sometime in that area, like the 15th to 17th centuries, depending on who you're talking to. And different areas of the world were developing at different rates too. So some people were already well into the modern era when others were just kind of starting to get on board with it.
Gotcha. All right. So, any other background about this claim before we get into the specific claim?
No, let's dive in.
Okay. Anything confusing potentially to people with the words? I think it's pretty clear. Like, no reliable method, no good way to tell when something was like came into creation, like a text prior to the 10th century. Is that right? What another good way to say that?
Right. And another way we could say it is we don't have any reliable methods to date texts more than 1,000 years back, because the 10th century implies that something happened 1,000 years before that. So that might actually be a better way to word it.
More than 10,000, 10,000,
1,000.
1,000 years ago.
Yep.
Yeah, that's probably more clear for people because we're in the 21st century and
Right.
yeah.
And all that is based on a guy's dates from supposedly the 6th century or 5th century, around that time. It got popularized, I think, in the 8th or ninth. It came into common use, I think, in the 11th or 12th.
Okay, yeah, how well, how long has human civilization, based on your understanding of time, how long have humans been civilized? Or, don't know. All right, so anyway, no reliable method exists to date text more than 1,000 years ago. All right, and what's your confidence about this?
Put it at like a 90.
90. Okay,
Yeah. Highly confident.
gotcha. And what's a good main reason for this?
Is that each method that does exist for dating texts is incredibly limited in scope. That's one reason.
Our current dating methods are limited in scope.
Yep.
Okay, what does that mean?
It means that while they can be useful for dating texts, they have their limits, and those limits don't reach beyond 1,000 years. So we could date texts from 100 years ago or 400 years ago, but the further back you go, the less reliable they get until they're not reliable.
Okay, and yeah, I guess the connecting assumption there related to this is if a dating method is limited, it can't go past the limit. Like that's the yeah.
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 Yeah. Well, yeah, that's a way of saying it.
That's just a very obvious, connecting assumption to the claim. Yeah, or just limits. You can't go past limits.
Mhm.
For whatever. I'll probably revise that. So now we need to. Okay, so is this true? Current dating methods are limited in scope. That's kind of. Well, that's first. Any other main reasons for this?
Any other main reasons for the claim?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that the information is lacking. There's not enough. Oh, for the assumption to that claim?
Or this, just any other just main reasons.
Like for a new box?
Yeah, new box.
All right, yeah. I don't think there's sufficient statistical reference, even sufficient historical reference to be able to determine things more than 1,000 years ago. So a lack of sufficient evidence.
Lack of sufficient evidence.
Yeah, that would be used for dating.
Of what?
For dating. So things that people would use to say that this is from 1,500 years ago. There's not enough evidence to be saying stuff like that.
Is there like a lack of things to date, or a lack of just what is?
Yeah, there's a lack of research too. Evidence and research combined. There haven't been enough studies done into gauging the accuracy of these tests, and then the evidence that does exist is somewhat lacking. So we could just stick with the research part for that one to not make it too complex. Lack of sufficient research for dating.
Okay. Cool. And I'm trying to new to Jamboards and all right. So
I like the Jamboard. It's cool.
Yeah, I like it too. Yeah. Maybe let's. Let's also do confidence for these things. What is your confidence about this?
I would put that, yeah, again at like 90.
90% again?
Yeah.
All right. For
I gotta
that.
have a discussion about this somewhere about using the percentages. We gotta come up with like a scale because
We don't have to use percentages. What's a better scale? What's a better way to do it?
like just like the feeling of it because I don't have any statistical reference to say like here are 10 things that I would need for my confidence to be. I got 9 out of 10 of those things, so
Yeah,
it's a 90%.
I'm not gonna hold you to like this to be very rigorous. This is just kind of like a gut feeling almost. Like
Yeah, right.
it's
Yeah,
your
that's why I think like high confidence, low, like super high. You could get like 10 things on a list from I don't think that at all to I'm totally convinced.
yeah. Is same for this as well, 90% or different?
Yeah, I would. Yeah, it's all highly confident, 90%.
Okay, and I think this is just true. You can't go past limits. All right. And once the connecting assumption for no reliable method exists to date text more than 1,000 years ago, and there's a lack of sufficient research for dating.
The assumption is that you need research done to date things. You need to have an empirical basis for coming up with your date.
Reliable methods require sufficient research.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. All right, so I'm interested in this reason. The current dating methods are limited in scope, so now we just kind of do a whole nother box for this reason. What's a reason for that reason? For that being true.
So the current dating methods, they haven't been around for very long. They've only been in development for a very short amount of time compared to the span of time that they're trying to date things on. So it's a very young method would be one of my reasons. Trying to keep it at one at a time.
Like current,
So
yeah. The
yeah,
dating
dating
method,
methods are new.
is that the best word, new or young or?
Young? Yeah, let's use young because it's like on traditionally contemporary. I think most historians would agree that we've got about 6,000 years of recorded human history, of civilized history, and these dating methods, most of them are either within the last 100 years or within the last like 400 years. And so that 100 to 400 years old is such a small fraction of 6,000 years.
Yeah, so let's define young even explicitly. Dating methods are less than
Young,
less than
you could say
100 years
young
old.
compared to the span in which they're trying to date.
Young compared to the span of time.
Yeah, that they're trying to date on.
They're trying to date. Okay, does that make sense? Dating methods
Yeah,
are young compared to the span of time they're trying
I
to
would
date.
I would slip in which between time and there. Yeah, that looks good.
Compared to the span of time in which they're trying to date. All right. Yeah, let's. What is that? What's about that relationship between the the age of the dating method compared or just related to the span of time in which they're trying to date? Why is that
So
relationship? What does that matter?
the assumption here would be that the longer the method has been around, the more accurate it will be.
Like that? The longer the method has been in use, the more accurate the method.
Yeah.
Okay. And dating methods are young. And you said how long? How old are these things?
like just a couple hundred years at most.
A couple hundred years. What's an example of some of these dating methods?
So there's paleographical dating methods. Those are the most common for dating texts. And then besides that, they have radiocarbon dating, which is very seldomly used compared to paleographical methods.
What is paleographical methods?
That's the methods used for determining authenticity of a text, determining where it came from, how old it is, and different aspects of how it's been recorded. Is it on animal skin or is it on plant matter? Things like that.
Okay. How how does the dating work? For like, what's an example of something dated using this?
So the way that I understand it is that there are already, um, when it first came about, other methods were used to establish the dates of these records. So it was at a time when whatever the library said goes. So the holders of the books knew best, and without any scientific basis, they would claim a record to be a certain age. Um, with the development of paleography, that a lot of these records have been shown to be from different times. But so basically, there are dates already attributed to some records, and then they compare the new records that they're trying to date to the already dated records. So, like, if I had a notebook that was from 20 years ago and you tried to compare the handwriting between now and then, you could try and say, well, this notebook from 20 years ago looks like this, and so does this one. So we think these are both from the same time period because they have the same similar writing styles.
Oh wow! So people would use comparisons of handwriting styles because it was just a certain culture had a handwriting style, and
Right.
okay.
This can also be done for the for book bindings. Certain styles of binding were used in certain areas, and so if you can determine when one binding was popular, then potentially you could date the other binding to that original one. So paleographical dating is, I think, largely based on visual comparisons.
Mere visual comparisons. Any other things paleographical method is using?
Yeah, that's a pretty basic overview of it, I think. Um,
It's not.
it's
It's not
you use
using.
text of a known age to date texts of an unknown age.
Yeah, there's no like forensics going on, right?
No, I think maybe that would fall under paleography, but I think that would more so fall under different types of analysis. Like they have cyclotron analysis to check the content of the ink for different metals, to see what the recipe was for a batch. So different batches have different content in them that can be analyzed through chemical analysis, I think is what it is.
Oh wow.
And that can kind of help, I think, a little bit, but I'm not sure if that would be considered within the scope of a paleographer. I think that would be more in the hands of a chemist.
Yeah, that would be kind of an interesting way to tie it to a place if they're using it an ingredient from this certain place where this ingredient only shows up,
Mm.
or some way somehow that ink was, you know, sold and traveled a big distance. So that would be an interesting way to tell where the original ink came from. I don't know. I'm just thinking.
Yeah, that can help with determining connectivity. So if you had two manuscripts that you thought weren't related at all, and the
Um,
ink is almost exactly the same, you could make an argument that they're actually related somehow. At least the ink was from the same source.
yeah, we're talking about like pre-printing press. It's people were writing. You know, people had their own ink and
Well,
or
even after the printing press, I think the earliest ink recipe that we have in writing has been dated to like the early 1600s. So we have a couple hundred years of ink usage without any knowledge of what exactly they were putting into it.
okay,
I mean, we could figure it out through chemical analysis, but we don't have their writings, their records saying we mixed so much of this with that.
okay. All right. What else about this reason? Dating methods are young compared to span of time in which they're trying to date. And the
So I
yeah,
do want to, since we have this on the board, the longer the method has been in use, the more accurate the method. I would want to change that because I don't think that's true. I think you could have a method in use for a long time and it could still be just as broken as it was when it started. I think the more data that a method has to go on, the more reliable it'll be. And the more time you have, the more data you can collect. I think that would be a more accurate representation of how I view this.
okay, so is this the best way to say it now? The more data a method uses, or the more reliable data a method uses?
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah.
It's kind of
It,
that's kind of a
you would
tautology.
need to put that in, yeah, the reliable data, because you wouldn't want to be basing your method on unreliable data.
The more reliable data a method uses, the more accurate the method. The more reliable data a method uses, the more accurate the method. Isn't it? Wouldn't reliable data isn't baked into the word reliable like accurate? Are we like saying the same thing twice?
Well, we could replace accurate with reliable because reliable data is different than a reliable method. And so you need reliable data to have a reliable method.
Or let's just say the the better the better data a method uses, the more reliable the method.
Maybe. I think that there is something to the amount of data being used, though. Like, for example,
Yeah,
they had,
quantity. The more quantity and quality. Is that what better means?
mm, maybe you could say the reliability of the method is based on the data that it uses. And then because of that, the more time that a method has been in use, the more data it will have obtained. Because this is being tied to the claim that dating methods are young compared to the span in which they're trying to date. And so there is a time element there as to beyond just what data is being used, but that the emphasis on this being collected over time and being worked in, being used while trying to develop the method. So like with radiocarbon dating, they've created a calibration scale, which will change the raw data and work in new data to try and get more accurate results.
What's some examples of like good data and bad data?
Good data and bad data. Good data would be, I think, data that doesn't have as many contradictions as bad data. So I guess at the top of the scale, you could have the best data is free of contradiction. The worst data is all contradiction. And so you could slide the scale between that.
So data metrics for testing the quality is contradictions, the amount of contradictions.
Yeah.
That's one metric.
Yeah, because you want it to be coherent.
Okay. No contradictions means coherent. Okay.
Right.
And what other metrics are there for figuring out the quality of data?
I would use that as just the baseline. I'm not sure what other metrics you could use.
Okay. So it's about the content of whatever's being written down. If it's not contradictory, it's better data.
Right.
And that, how does the coherence or the amount of contradictions in something relate to its date?
To the date that it's assigned. Like if an item has been dated, how does the coherence relate to that?
Yeah, if we like found some, but potentially ancient text and it was super coherent, no contradictions, how could we be able to date that?
Right. Well, that's where these methods are being used. So they can be used for kind of recent stuff that we can check with more than one way. The older stuff is more difficult. So you could have something paleographically dated to the 4th century and then have it carbon dated to the 1,000 years later or so. Um,
So there could be conflicts between these different dating methods.
I
Yeah.
here I have a real example. There's it's called the Lehigh horse. It was discovered in a couple years ago, I think, and it was dated through archaeological methods to being, I think, like 14,000 years old about. So like that's a really old horse. And then they did radiocarbon dating on it, and they determined it was about 400 years old. And so you have two different methods that are both considered legitimate on their own, and then when they're paired up with each other, they contradict each other. And so determining which one of those is more accurate is the issue that's trying to be sorted out.
How does radiocarbon dating work?
That's testing the carbon content in a organism. They run it through accelerator mass spectrometry, uh, spectrometry.
So this was a living horse. It's not like a statue or something, or
No, it's a dead horse.
a dead horse.
Well, it was alive at one time. So carbon dating, it can only be used on organic material that was once living and then has since died.
Okay, so that's a big disparity: 400 versus 14,000.
Yeah. And you can use it on living things too, but so like trees, they've taken new carbon and their outer rings, like the outer part, and the inner part has older carbon in it that's decaying because the middle of the tree is dead. So they've also tried to do it on live mollusks. I think they've done that, and it shows that some of these things have been dated like they were alive. They were dated like 4,000 years old. I think they did it on a tree that showed that the tree shouldn't have even been around for another 600 years is what the content was. So
like
it was like trying to say this thing hadn't even been born yet.
Okay, let me try to repeat back my understanding of radio. Like living things replace their carbon. Like humans replace like all of their, cells at some point over. It was over 7 years or something. Like we're just replacing stuff all the time. But if we die, we're not replacing stuff anymore because we're dead. So now like a timer starts, and we can potentially date what our current carbon content. It'll decay, or certain isotopes or whatever will start decaying at a certain rate, and does that happen reliably for all carbon creatures?
Well, when they first started doing it, that was the assumption that it decays at a steady rate. I think it's called the law of exponential decay. And then they discovered that it doesn't actually do that. So they have to calibrate it. And they have tried to figure out the calibration curve by dating things that they think they know the age of.
They have to use things they've already dated in other ways to kind of compare their accuracy.
Right.
Okay. All right. So this horse, 400 versus 14,000, how old really is it? And how can we tell? What do you think?
Yeah, it's a good question. Again, this I think is about the more data, the better. The more information we have about this type of thing, the better. So I think it was found at the bottom of like a dried up lake. So the idea is that it was run into there at some point in its life and it died down there. The reason why they think it's more recent is because it's got signs of being used by humans. And so
It didn't have
trying to
like
date it.
a saddle on it or anything, or any other human things.
No, it didn't have anything extra, but I think it did have some fractures in the bones that showed that it was being used for carrying materials for humans. And so on some level, it was being used by humans. So one way we could date that is by referring to the scholarship on the human use of horses and trying to figure out when different types of horses were used by certain types of people. But yeah, again, it's you would have to rely on different dating methods to then try and date this itself. So yeah, how would we go about actually dating it? Yeah, I think really the best thing we can do is just throw as many methods at it as possible and try and refine those methods as best as possible, which is kind of what my whole deal is trying to um, analyze and improve the dating methods that do exist.
Okay. So, yeah, going back to just human text, no reliable method exists to date text more than 1,000 years ago. And the main reason for that we're talking about now is the current dating methods are limited in scope, and dating methods are young compared to the span of time in which they're trying to date. How does that relate to the limit of scope?
Well, I think it's because it's limited in their um, data set that they use. So, like, the better data a method uses, the more reliable it is, and the more data they'll have over a greater span of time. So, when you're actively looking for data to help increase or improve a dating method, more time is better. And these are still incredibly young. So, they're still wrestling with some really fundamental issues.
Yeah, the scope is like the amount of time potentially that we're trying to date things back to. Like if our scope is limited to 1,000 years, we can't date things more than that. So that's a limit. So now the dating methods we're currently using are young compared to the span of time in which they're trying to date. I'm still not clear on. So it wouldn't matter. Our dating methods wouldn't matter if they're accurate up to 1,000 years. If we just wanted to date things within that time period, then we would be fine. But if we want to do things older than that, then we have an issue, you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, as I'm looking at it, maybe it's not a good reason to think that the dating methods are limited in scope. But that was the first one that came to mind, is just the youngness of them.
Yeah, I'm really wondering about why is the limit there? What is limiting these methods?
Just the lack of knowledge. That's where the second thing is lack of sufficient research.
Is this a reason for this? The lack of sufficient research?
Yeah, it can be for that and for the original.
And for the original? Okay. What would need to be true in order for a a dating method to be not limited in scope? What would that mean?
Hmm. Right. I think dating methods will always be limited in scope. So I think I don't think there is anything that could not limit the scope. The only thing that could happen is if dating methods or the people employing them were to become omniscient. They would have knowledge of everything, and therefore they wouldn't be limited. So maybe it'd be better to tweak that claim to make it more relevant to this original claim.
Which claim?
So yeah, to tweak current dating methods to fit the no reliable methods exist. You could
So change what to what?
change the current dating methods. I guess like you would just say that they can only date text within the last like 5 to 1,000 years or so.
I think that's what that means. Limited in scope, right?
Yeah, but it's a bit more specific because it's talking exactly about how it's limited instead of just saying that they're limited, because I think that's more of a given.
To limit it to know more, to know no more. What's the right word? To know.
Are You could say the reliability of current dating methods is limited to just the last 1,000 years, which is just another way of saying the original claim. So I think that might be considered circular. if we're saying the same claim is true because the claim says it's true
Yeah,
type thing.
yeah, that's the claim. No reliable method exists to date text more than 1,000 years ago. And why? Or because the current dating methods are limited in scope.
We could, yeah, I mean, we could even just delete that original one because I think the second one is more important because that talks about the dating methods. I think the dating methods are kind of implied in the original one because it,
So just delete this box and put this as the main reason.
yeah, we've kind of doubled that original reason.
Okay, that works. We can do that. If I can get this to work. All right. So now this is the main reason. No reliable method exists to date text more than 1,000 years ago because the dating methods.
Well, I would put the lack of sufficient research for dating as the main reason.
Okay, we can just go with that. This is the main reason. And why is the lack of sufficient research for dating? Why is there a lack of sufficient research for dating? Because of this?
Well, why is there a lack? You could say lack of interest. Most people don't care. So there's lack of funding.
There's a lack of interest in researching
Dating methods.
Yeah, we need people interested to research it.
Right.
There is a lack of interest. What does that mean? Like, there's only 2 people doing it in the world right now, or 100?
I mean, for provenance research, for what I've been looking into, yeah, I'd say there is maybe only 2 people in the world, and I'm one of them. There's my friend, Dr. Falk. He's an Egyptologist. He said that there was a book coming out that he was asked to peer review, and there was only one other person, I think, in the world that was looking into the same subject. Or there were 2 people in the world. He was one of them, so we know who the other one was, even though it was supposed to be anonymous.
Okay.
So yeah, the lack of interest, that's a reason why there's lack of sufficient research.
Okay. What else is lacking besides interest? Is it
Funding.
the lack of funding?
Yep.
There's a lack of funding. If I can type.
So people that are interested in it, they can't afford to research.
Okay. Lack of funding for researching dating methods. Lack of interest. Lack of sufficient research. So if we did have sufficient research, then we'd be able to tell what are good dating methods to go past 1,000 years? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay. And right now we don't have the research to tell what would be good methods to do that at this point?
You say that again?
If we don't have sufficient research for figuring out reliable dating methods, then you're saying we currently don't have any reliable methods to date anything past 1,000 years ago. So now we need research on the dating methods to get, knowledge about, the dating of stuff that is more than 1,000 years ago. So that's the goal, to be able to date stuff older than that, and a method to do that is research. And we don't know what it would take at this point. We don't know how. We just need better research to tell.
Well, there's some things that we know we could do to improve the situation, but again, lack of interest and funding is slowing that quite a bit.
Okay. Anything plausible? Any plausible hypotheses for research methods? Or anything currently, being worked on?
Like any projects that are currently working on improving the dating methods?
Or just,
Because I mean, basically everyone that's working with dating methods, I think, are trying to at least the majority of them are trying to improve the methods. They want their methodology to be accurate. So, yeah, I think that is something that's going on. Is there is improvements being made, but
Yeah.
the discussions are really limited, if they're even being had at all. Some people, I have, the only reason why I wouldn't say all of them is because I have seen reports from people working like with carbon dating saying that they would just ignore the dates that don't support what they thought they would support, and so they only publish the good ones. And so that would lead me to believe that that's another reason why sufficient research is lacking, because bad research is covered up or ignored. Only the good one is heralded or paraded.
Yeah. I guess like the gold standard of like research date or of a dating method is a time machine, or you said omniscience. But we don't have the time machines to check, our guesses for how old things are. So now we're kind of back to now figuring, like, guessing with using these methods. But
Yeah,
but we have no absolute way to like test, what the actual actual accurate answer is. So we're inferring from other things to
right.
tell.
It's a lot of inference.
Yeah. What are like good
Really, the
good things to infer from?
good things to infer from
Yeah.
I think, would be the evidence that actually exists. So, well, yeah, this kind of goes back to the deductive inductive methodology test of, we kind of know that things work a certain way, so we can be inductive through logic. If something's not logical, we can look further into it. The more logical it is, the stronger it is, kind of thing. Which is what I was talking about with coherence. Inductive is, or deductive, I think, would be that.
Yeah, coherence is deductive.
So
Like,
yeah, that would be
yeah.
deductive. Inductive would be using actual evidence. So if we're talking about something like texts, manuscripts, we can actually look at the manuscript itself. There's something physical, tangible that we can analyze and crunch into data.
And then the third one is like abduction, which is what is that? What is that phrase? Reason to the best available. What is that phrase? I forget. For abduction,
I don't know.
it's like best. It's our best guess based on everything we know. So we're kind of limited to these ways of inferring: deduction, induction, abduction, the physical. So let's go through some examples of things we're trying to date. What's something you want to be able to date that you can't date right now?
The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle.
What is that?
That's the main document for English history.
The main document for English history?
Yeah, it's a collection of manuscripts. I think there's about 9 to 11 of them, depending on where you read. But they're called the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. They're all used together to put together a narrative on English history.
Okay. And what is the current consensus on the date for these things?
I think 8th or 9th century is when they were considered to first be compiled. And then from there, the manuscripts that we do have fall in between then and I don't know. Definitely before the 15th century, I think.
Okay. And you're saying we can't be confident that they actually were written or came into being in the 8th and 9th century? What do you estimate it to be? Or do you just not know? You're saying we shouldn't know?
I don't know, but I don't think we can reliably say that it's from that long ago. So yeah, it's yeah, I don't know. I don't have the dates here for when they were made. Oh well. Um Yeah, I think that potentially they were created at a later date. Um, I think there's reason to suspect that they were purposely fabricated, but that's just one example.
Let's go back to the original claim. What do you mean by reliable? Like,
Right.
like 100%? No, you mean like above 50 or
Like a 90%, like a highly confident,
at least 90?
rely,
At least 90%,
reliable, something we can rely on. A method that, yeah,
like that.
yeah, but even the statistics there, it throws me off because what is that even based on?
Yeah, what does that even mean for the?
90%.
Or
Like,
are
is
we
that out of like
saying,
a pool of 15 different things or 100 things that you could check off to determine reliability?
yeah, like how confident are you that the Anglo-Saxon chronicles were written in the 8th or 9th century?
Not very confident.
Like less than 50?
Yeah, like maybe in like the lower 20%.
You're lower 20 for this because it's much longer than 1,000 years ago, and we don't have reliable methods to get at least 90%.
Not because of that, just because of human intervention, people being deceptive with their writings.
Yeah, that's another problem. Humans can lie. Like I can write something right now and say I'm writing from the 8th century, and
Yeah,
like make it
and
look old. And
the heyday of forgery and creating false histories was really around that time that they all kind of start to appear. Um, like people, there's this guy, Trithemius, I think his name is. He's considered the father of bibliography, which is an auxiliary science of history, and he forged 1,000 years of fake history that people bought. So he was just making up history. This Anglo-Saxon Chronicle covers about the same period of time, and it appeared after him. This all the manuscripts. This is what I was talking about with provenance studies: is the study of the history of ownership or the history of an object. And so, like, the perfect time machine wouldn't just be a time machine; it'd be a time machine that you could focus on an item and then travel back in time. So, like, I wouldn't time travel 100 years back and still be in the same geographical position. I could attach the machine to an object and see where the materials come from and like when it was first created and stuff like that. Because that would be really useful for studying where these manuscripts come from. You could just watch it all back through time and get back to the first guy that penned it. But
yeah, you're
yeah,
like what is that? Scrooge's ghost type of thing, history of ghost past. Like you're just watching things, be transferred in ownership over time. Like what's happening to this one object? Because it's about an object. That's what we're studying, a thing or a person or an area. We need something to study as part of being in time. So yeah, it has to be about a possession or a person. Okay.
yeah, you're asking about how do we determine if something's reliable, and again, I think I would fall back on the coherency standard. If it's coherent, then the potential for its reliability is a lot higher than if it's incoherent.
The coherency standard.
Yeah, so you depend on coherency and the yeah.
Incoherent, like for the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, how would we tell if it was coherent?
So for well that would be for the no reliable method. So we can't determine if the text itself is reliable, but if we're determining the dating of the text, we can figure out if that's reliable. And so if we have like no mentions or anything, yeah,
Like,
I
like,
would.
like a text itself needs to be. Are you saying it? The more coherent it is, the more reliable it's saying what it's saying is true.
Well, the method is different than the text. So
Yeah, yeah.
the reliability of the text, that is a separate issue than the reliability of the dating of the text.
Couldn't we accurately date a book of lies and incoherencies?
Yes. So yeah, that's the distinction I'm making. We could identify the true date of an object, and to determine if that dating is reliable or not,
So
you would
how does the coherency standard relate to the to reliable in terms of the methods of the dating methods?
right. So if the dating methods are giving out a bunch of different dates, then we could consider those less reliable because they're incoherent with each other, like with the Lehigh horse.
Yeah, the horse can't be both 400 years old and 14,000 years old. That's incoherent.
Right. And
Yeah.
so a coherent thing would be if it was archaeologically dated to 400 years ago, carbon dated to 400 years ago, zoologically dated, genetically dated. If all of those said 400 years, that would be more reliable.
So what we mean by reliable really is like, you know, the standards, point to the same time. All of the standards, or most, virtually all the standards, point to the same
The
time.
Because even then, we're determining the reliability based on the other methods, assuming they're getting the right date. So yeah, this is an interesting discussion for me, at least.
Like, well, if we had 5 different dating methods, and they had a range of potential times they're saying something is a certain age. If dating method 1 is saying, well, it's at least 100 years old, dating method 2 is saying it can't be more than 200 years old, dating method 3 is saying it's 125 years old to 175 years old, dating method 4 is saying it's 150 years old, and dating method 5 is saying it's exactly 150 years old in 6 months. I don't know. And that's all coherent, right?
Kind of. There's some wiggle room, like differences between the two. If one says 125 and one says 175, but even that is, I don't think that this would prove the reliability of the method. I think that would just raise the confidence in the dating. Like for some people, like
Yeah, we're using all of these things to compare against the other ones, and they seem to they're all compatible with the claim. They're none of them are being falsified by any other of them, right?
right. So I think maybe, but still, I don't think that the reliability is going to be determined by all the different methods giving the same date. I think that's just going to have an influence on how confident someone's going to be. So reliability, I think, would be how reliable it is internally. So just on its own, without needing to use something else. So just carbon dating something.
What do you mean? Like an internal coherence?
So like they did these tests where they sent out samples of known ages to different laboratories, and they all came back with different dates spanning many different centuries. And so carbon dating in that situation is unreliable for dating that material because the same method is being used, and one method is giving multiple different dates that don't coincide with each other. So that would undermine the reliability of the method because you could use the same method to get a bunch of different ideas.
Oh, how did that work in that example?
So instead of combining a bunch of methods, you're focusing on one method and getting a bunch of different results. So like you could date something with a single method to 50 years ago, 500 years ago, or 1,000 years ago. That's not really reliable if you could get any one of those dates.
Has something been tested in this? It's like separate tests for the dating of an object using one method, and the tests produce different results, which makes the method unreliable. If it's producing, a reliable method should produce the same result every time you try it.
Right.
And some methods produce different results every time it's tried, so that's unreliable.
Yeah.
What's an example of something that's been tested using a dating method? What is the dating method, and what were the results specifically? Any idea? Any examples?
I can't recall right off the top of my head. I do have a link to it on my website somewhere, but what I just mentioned was they did a controlled study where they sent items all of the same age to different laboratories that all did carbon dating on it, and the different laboratories came back with different results that could not possibly be rationalized other than that something was wrong in one of the labs or the method is unreliable.
And this was like dead tissue of things that
Yeah.
that people knew how old whatever this dead tissue was.
Yeah, I think it was trees potentially. I'm all going from memory.
Okay. The people who sent the dead trees to the lab knew how old the tree was, knew when the tree died or something. They just knew how old it was.
Yeah, it was objects of a known date.
Object of a known date.
So they kind of already knew the date,
How
what they
did
were looking for.
how did they know the days of whatever they were sending?
Yeah, exactly. Through different methods.
And how old were these things they were sending them?
I think just a couple hundred years.
So they weren't alive to tell whatever, right?
Right.
So now what methods were they using to date it?
Yeah, I don't know. I would have to look more into the study.
Why should we believe the people who tried to test the radiocarbon dating lab of whatever they're saying is old? Like, I'd want to know, like, can I test the people sending the stuff to the lab? Can I test them, whatever they're doing? Can people send stuff to them
Yeah,
with a
yeah,
known
you
time?
could if you wanted to.
Okay.
I mean, it'll cost you a couple $100, but you could send one sample for a couple $100.
Yeah.
I think that's what it costs. There was an article talking about the pricing that they put on it, and they said the pricing is arbitrary just so that people don't goof around and like send them stuff. But that also makes it difficult to research it because it costs so much to do it.
What is like an object between 100 years old and 500 years old that we are virtually certain we know exactly how old that thing is? Is it like, I don't know. What's an example?
Um, I mean, we could use the Parker register. I think everyone's fairly certain that that was created in the 1600s.
Not a method, but like a thing. What's the best example of a thing we are virtually certain we know how old it is? That's older than 100 years old.
Yeah, the Parker register. It's a manuscript.
Oh, it's a manuscript. Sorry,
Yeah,
I thought that was.
it's
I thought
yeah,
that was a
it's a
method.
register of Matthew Parker's library.
Who was Matthew Parker?
He was the Archbishop of Canterbury.
Oh, that okay. He had a register of what was in his library.
Yeah, he gave it to Christ Church. Yeah, Archbishop of Canterbury.
Okay.
He gave it to Christ Church Corpus Christi Cambridge, I think is what it's called. Corpus Christi Cambridge College. I think there's 4 C's in their title.
Okay. Say we wanted to just start from scratch and date that thing. What are the top 2 or 3 methods we would go about doing that?
We could check the handwriting, so that is a method that is used. Certain styles were used in use at certain points in time. We could check for the contents of the book to see what's mentioned and what's not. So if there's nothing, like it's a catalog of books in a library. So if there's books listed in that catalog from like the 1800s and not the 1600s when we thought it was from, then we'd think it's from a later date, or maybe somebody put that in there at a later date.
Yeah, he can't have a book that wasn't written yet.
Right.
That's
Yeah.
one way to tell.
So
Okay.
we would be looking for stuff like that. Again, the binding, you could check that, but
What is that?
it was
What do
around
you-
that time that a lot of books were rebound. So a lot of older manuscripts are in fresher covers.
What do you mean check the binding?
So like book bindings, they're done in a specific way. Like This book right here is the way that it was bound and is all put together. This style is very specific. The way that these things are on here.
The style of putting all the pages together, yeah,
Yeah.
and the covers, like yeah, what the quality looks like of that. Okay.
And yeah, and even with that, like you can tear the book down to its singular parts. So you could have an 18th century binding on a 15th century work. And then in that, you could even have pages that were lost and then replaced in the 17th century. And so it's an amalgamation of things from different times, which a lot of manuscripts are like that.
Yeah, so it's kind of like just a, you know, bunch of clues, and you're putting all these clues together, and then you're just making a case for it. Any other things besides handwriting content and the binding?
Yeah, I mean, you could check if we had like a cyclotron database or something to check the ink against other inks, you could potentially trace it back to a specific batch that was made if we know when that batch was made.
Yeah, and like the paper is dead trees. Can we carbon date the paper in some way?
Yeah, you can carbon date manuscripts, so that would be another way we could try and get a date for it.
Yeah, but that you could just have. How do people make paper? Do you have to have like freshly dead trees, or can you use super old trees? I don't know how that works.
I think they do use fresh trees to get the paper and they cut it real thin, but I could be wrong about that.
Okay, so a bunch of things. So that yeah,
I mean, yeah, you could really tear down into it. The style of writing, even not even the handwriting, but different punctuation, different words that are used, the way that they set the page up can be checked. You check the colophon or the the front page for who printed it and when. Um, there's a lot of different ways you
yeah.
could approach it.
Who do we call the people who do this process? Chronologists or
Paleographers,
paleographers? Okay, we find like the top 5 teams of paleologers in the world.
or yeah, or you could do bibliologists. I think the people who
Bibliologists.
studied the history of books. So
So
yeah, you'd want paleographers and bibliologists.
yeah, and it's also just like the consensus of peer-reviewed experts. These so like the top 5 teams of paleologists or bibliographers. If we find a new object and we send this object to each of these 5 teams, and they each come up with a date, we would and they all use the same methods. If they all 5 of them, without talking to each other, gave the same date, that would be a good reason to think the methods were reliable.
Well, it would be a good reason to think that they came up with the same date,
Yeah,
but as
yeah,
far
that's
as
not
the reliability of the methods goes, I don't know.
Yeah, I want. Is that as best?
Because
Is that as best we
because
can do?
then you can. Sorry,
Is that the best we can do?
I think so. I mean, yeah, checking out what the experts have to say and working to improve that.
Okay. If like an expert chronologist or bibliographer came on the Zoom and saw this claim, what would they think?
Well, I don't think there are any experts in chronology. There might be some experts in bibliology.
Yeah, bibliology.
Yeah, bibliology is the study of books, the history of books too.
Yeah, and we're talking about the text. So yeah, if they came on,
So,
what would they say? What would be the counter? What would be the most popular counter to this? You would think if a bibliographer came on here.
I mean, just the opposite assertion that there are reliable methods, and then they would go and talk about all the methods I've already talked about, and then but take it from the stance that they are reliable, and so the results that we get from them indicate that they are older than the 10th century
Yeah, what would be
or
what would be a
1,000 years
reason
ago.
they would give to counter that? They would say there are. Why would they say that?
Why would they say that?
Yeah,
A lack of education, maybe.
or just
They don't.
what would their reason be?
Oh, what would their reason be for,
Yeah.
like, what would their supporting argument be for their
Yeah, yeah.
saying that there is?
Yeah, yeah.
Mm, what would their reason be for saying that there are reliable methods that exist? Maybe the coherency thing, that we have methods that seem to be coherent, and so why would we doubt that?
So they would say coherent dating methods exist?
Yeah, maybe. I can't say exactly what they'd say, but or maybe I can predict it. I just wouldn't have any way of knowing if the prediction is correct if until it happens.
They would say they would think is this their best reason they could give?
Yeah, I don't know. I'd be interested. I mean, it's the weirdest thing. Like I've been studying this for a few years, and the same people that will say, "Oh yeah, we got to question everything. Like we can't really know anything for certain." Then they're really dogmatic about the, "Oh no, we know for sure that this was around like this long ago." And so I think potentially it's a incoherent thing they haven't dealt with in their own belief system yet.
Hmm. Who would be a good person to ask? Or
About
who?
dating methods.
Yeah, that would be against this.
Well, the way I would go about it would be checking for who is an expert in the field. So if we were doing carbon dating, I would look into some of the carbon dating labs and then go about talking to them.
Yeah,
Um,
what is the claimed range of reliable dating for carbon dating?
it depends on who you ask, but it ranges anywhere from like a year to 70,000 years.
Oh, so that would be awesome if that was reliable. That's a
Yeah.
long time span. A year to 70,000 years.
Yep. Sometimes it'll be 100 to 70,000 years.
Sometimes what?
Depending on who you talk to. Generally, sometimes they'll cut the off limit at 50,000.
Okay, well, 50,000,
Yeah, it's a little
70,000.
bit of variation. Like the minimum is usually like 1 to 1,000, and then the maximum is like 50 to 70.
50 to 70. Okay, that's still pretty good.
But
If
the
it's reliable.
minimum is really what we're interested in, because that's really what a lot of it is based on, is the idea that we take in carbon during our lifetime, we die, and then it starts its decay, and it decays at a constant rate that we know.
Yeah, if we took, if you know, if we got permission to date people who died 10 years ago with carbon dating, would this method reliably produce? Yeah, these people died. Like say 1,000 people. How many out of the 1,000 would this method say died 10 years ago? If we knew, you know, they actually did die 10 years ago. Is that
I
how
don't
that
know, but
works?
I would be interested in seeing the results of that. I know they've done this with seals, and the seals came back thousands of years older than what they were.
Okay. If we
Like they
did,
shot some seals, they
yeah.
dated them right away, and then they were like hundreds of years older than they actually were. And then they mummified them, I think, for 30 years or 40, and they came back like thousands of years older than they were.
Oh wow. So people have been trying to break the carbon dating methods with different ways.
Testing it, yeah.
Yeah,
The
testing it.
the explanation is that I think it's the marine reservoir effect, is that animals in the ocean aren't getting as much carbon because of their diet and the way that the carbon interacts with the water.
How does it work exactly? Do they just take a tissue sample? How does that work? And then how do they test it?
I think they take, yeah, a small sample of it, and then they run it through the AMS machine.
Like a sample on the skin, or like as deep inside the body as possible? Does it matter what kind?
Yeah, I don't know the specifics on that.
Is it bones? Is it
I
some?
don't
I'm
think
sure.
it's typically bones. I think it is generally the flesh of the animal.
Okay. All right. Any other potential reasons against this? from people would say?
Um,
What would be, and here's another question. What, if a reason was given, what's a reason that someone could give that, if true, would change your confidence? Like
if
lower it.
somebody could point to some substantial research that had been done, and I could look at that and see.
What would the research have to say?
Like I've come up with a couple different blueprints on things we could do. We could determine the validity of carbon dating through testing thousands of samples of known age. So like something that we just killed. I mean, this would take a couple decades, maybe even centuries to do this study, but it would be useful in the long run to take like 1,000 samples for each climate of the world, and then keep them in that different climate. We could even potentially do controlled climates in a lab or something, and then test these for the decay rates and see if any decay faster than others. What would be the reason for that? To really analyze that, I'm not aware of any studies like this that have been done. So most studies that I've seen are about the getting ages for unknown aged items. So very few studies are based on objects of a known age, and then those studies are typically for items that are much older than a couple hundred years. So yeah, the question, what could they show me? Yeah, some new research would be nice. Potentially a good I would like a history book on the history of carbon dating. That would be nice to have. Usually the history of it is a footnote in the textbook on how to do it.
Yeah, I'm sure there's graveyards all over the world with like the exact year all these people have died. If you got permission, hypothetically, to date the dead bodies, and we know because they have gravestones and we know what year they died. What's our oldest graveyard in the world with a human body?
I would imagine thousands and thousands of years old is what it's been dated to.
And we could if we could get to a body in that oldest graveyard, we could potentially radiocarbon date that body.
Well, yeah, they did this with Egyptian mummies, and it turned out that the mummies, so they carbon dated the mummy and they carbon dated the wrap that the mummy was in, and there was a massive deviation between when they thought the mummy was made and when the wrap was made. And so it was supposed to not have been touched for thousands of years, but the idea based on the carbon dating is that at some point maybe somebody broke into the tomb and rewrapped the mummy and then left without leaving a trace, or there was an issue with the dating that took place, maybe some contamination, but they reconcile it to the best of their abilities, the deviations. So it would be difficult to determine if something really was as old as that.
I mean, yeah, like if we hypothetically tested every dead body that was at least a year old, and we know when we did it because of the gravestone year, and we did this through radiocarbon dating, and every time it said, yep, that's exactly the year. That's exactly, it matches up exactly. That would be good.
I gotta interrupt you. I want to say this first. Anybody that's watching this, send me links if you know about this stuff that I said I haven't seen. Like if you know about it, I want to know about it. I do my best to get my name out there so that people know I'm looking into this. If you have relevant information that is for this, please send it my way. Now, the other thing I wanted to say is it would be really cool if they could get like something like an organ donor check, like you check it on your license to donate your organs. If you could check a box to be into that study, like if you die, you've checked the box, like they can take a piece of your skin to go do that carbon dating on it to see if it's legit, like if the method holds up.
Yeah, they'd have to dig you up and take a
Well,
sample.
no, they wouldn't, because
Or,
it would be already determined before your death that you consent to them taking that.
oh,
So when
before
you
they bury
die,
you, they just take some sample
yeah, like
and
if
store
you're an
those
organ
samples.
donor, you get killed, somebody needs a heart transplant or something,
Yeah,
they just take your heart. But any time that you die, it doesn't matter. They can get a sample from you. They know when you died, so they
so
can
like,
test it.
so use all the useful organs and then find some whatever the best piece of other sample, piece of you to put in like a chronology study, or what's the best word for it?
Carbon dating study, yeah,
Carbon
to
dating
test
study.
for carbon dating. But it would be interesting if they took samples from each of the organs and different organs came back with different carbon dates. That would be an interesting
Would,
result too.
would they date it like once a year? Like, okay,
They could if they wanted to, yeah.
a year
They
has
could.
passed. This should be a year old. We test it. Okay, yeah, it says it's a year old. We do it, say, 5 years later. Okay, this should be 5 years old. Let's test it. Oh, yep, it says 5 years old. And we just keep doing this over the next 1,000 years, and every time it's exactly what it should be. That
At
would be
that point, I would concede that, yeah, there's a reliable dating method. I don't think I'd need 1,000 years of it, but even if that went on for like 50 years, I think I would be more convinced than I am presently.
yeah, that would do it for me too. That was great. Good stuff. All right. Anything else about this, Stephen?
Um, I'm still trying to think of rebuttals, and it's weird. I read this book that talks about IQ tests. They did IQ tests on people, and then they had them like defend a claim or something. And basically, what it showed is like people that had higher IQs could come up with more reasons for why they were right about something than people with lower IQs. But people, it didn't matter what your IQ was, they were almost about the same as coming up with reasons why they were wrong on something. And
Mm-hmm.
so I'm trying really hard here to come up with more rebuttals to this claim, other than coherent dating methods exist, other than just the assertion of the opposite. I will say, though, after having this conversation, my confidence does drop on the original claim.
Oh yeah.
I'd maybe put it at 50-50, but I might even, like, for that claim specifically, I would even maybe want to tweak the claim just. But when I do that, it changes it from being an on like a assertion of absolute truth, like this is the way it is. I would change it just to I think there's no reliable methods that exist, and
The think
that
is
is not
the think
not
is
nearly.
through the confidence is the level of certainty of the claim. So that's what that means. That's
Well,
what.
yeah, I mean, I would be 100% certain that I think this, but as to whether it's true or
Yeah.
not, whether what I think is true would be a 50, because it's either it's right or it's wrong. If we're doing statistics here, I'm either on the right end of it or the wrong end.
You, are you 50% confident that it's true now? Is that what
Well,
that
yeah,
means? Yeah. Okay.
but on the obverse, I'm 50% confident that it's not true.
Mm-hmm. And and this is a claim you're thinking about. Yeah. Cool. Cool. Nice. Well, we can feel free to schedule another Calendly thing, and we can talk about it more if you come across more reasons against or for. This is interesting.
Right. Yeah. And yeah, really the whole idea, it does rest on that lack of sufficient research, and also not being able to talk to the experts is also somewhat of a reason why I would think that, just because there aren't the people that I have talked to that try to prop themselves up as experts, they've all been so rude and so unhelpful. They haven't given me anything to work with. And so that's why I made that note earlier. Like, if you know about the research that would change my mind, send it my way, because I'm not going to change my mind just because someone called me an idiot and said that I should research it more. Like, I spend all my time, like most of my free time is spent trying to figure this stuff out and having conversations like this one.
Yeah, my truth is a big value for me, and history is important. What actually happened in the past is important to know. And so I appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Likewise.
Cool. And cut it there.